Hello, and welcome to the Future Christian Podcast, your source for insights and ideas into what it means to live as a follower of Jesus in the 21st century. At the Future Christian Podcast, we talk to pastors, authors, and other faith leaders for helpful advice and practical wisdom to help you and your community of faith walk boldly into the future. Here's your host, Lauren Richmond Jr.
Hey, thanks for listening in to the Future Christian Podcast. My name is Lauren Richmond Jr., and I'm pleased to be joined by Dr. Thomas Jay Oord. Hello.
Hey, thanks so much for the opportunity for this conversation, Lauren.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for being here. Tom is a theologian, philosopher, and scholar of multidisciplinary studies. He's a best-selling and award-winning author, having written or edited more than 25 books. He directs a doctoral program at Northwind Theological Seminary and the Center for Open and Relational Theology. He's a 12-time faculty award-winning professor and teaches at multiple institutions around the globe. He's known for his contributions to research on love, open and relational theology, science and religion, and the implications of freedom and relationships for transformation. So anything else you'd like to let our guests know about yourself or our listeners? Yeah.
Listening to that description, if I was someone listening to this podcast, I'd think, this guy can't settle on any one subject. He's interested in too many things, and that's probably right. My interests are wide and varied.
So tell us a little bit about your journey of faith, how you got into studying theology for a living, so to speak.
Yeah, I grew up in a fairly conservative evangelical home in a little farming town in Washington State. Church was a really important part of our family life, and I like to say I gave my heart to Jesus many times as a kid. Mm-hmm. I also took evangelism very seriously. When I was in college, I was one of those people who bugged you at the airport or door to door or on the street, handing out pamphlets and things. Then my final year in college, I took a course in philosophy of religion. Mm-hmm. And for the first time, I read really smart people from other religious traditions, atheists, agnostics, and the fundamental reasons I had for believing in God didn't seem to make a lot of sense anymore.
Wow.
And for the sake of intellectual honesty, I became an atheist, or at least an agnostic. I called myself an atheist.
Yeah.
And but for me, turning away from belief in God wasn't based on like a rebellious streak, or like I wasn't mad at the hypocrites in the church or something like that. For me, it was really an intellectual thing. It was I have to have good reasons to believe there's a God, and the reasons I used to have I now doubt. So I was an atheist for a short period of time, but I eventually came to think that there is a God based primarily on two things. At least then. It's kind of broadened now, but then it was two things. One, I wanted to believe there was something like ultimate meaning in life. And I couldn't believe in ultimate meaning if there wasn't something like an ultimate source or ground for meaning that lots of people call God. Mm-hmm. And then secondly, I had this deep intuition, and I still have it today, that I ought to be a person who loved, and that other people ought to love, that in some important and deep way that love was the answer. And I couldn't make sense of that intuition if there wasn't a source of love or an ultimate ground of love that most people call God. And so based on those two assumptions or beliefs or presuppositions, I decided it was more plausible than not that there was a God, and that's basically where I'm at today. I don't know with certainty there's a God, but I think it's plausible given various factors, arguments, experience, etc.
You mentioned like your conservative upbringing.
Yeah.
Was that hard? I ask as someone who underwent a similar journey. Was it hard for you to kind of live initially with that uncertainty of like, Because if your upbringing was anything like mine, I mean, there wasn't much room for uncertainty. It was either you believe or you don't.
Hey, hard is too mild of a word. I mean, yeah, just incredibly difficult. And to be honest, it's still difficult today because I have lots of friends who are still conservatives. I'm kind of a bridge builder kind of person. I live on the boundaries of lots of communities.
Yeah.
So, and I've got plenty of people who want to correct me in the way I think. So yeah, it was hard, to say it mildly.
Yeah, it's interesting you use the word bridge builder. I remember a pastor I met probably 12, 15 years ago used that word for me, and I'm recognizing it's becoming a prophecy in many ways for my ministry and career. But yeah, I think that's one of the things that I always found frustrating, and I imagine you did too, was that folks would kind of dismiss my theological wanderings as a lack of faith or the easy way out. And I imagine if you're like me, it's like, no, that's far more harder than just believing.
Yes, that's right. Well, and I was also, maybe you're like this, I was a person who took the Bible and theology and then philosophy later very seriously. So it's not like I'm just winging it, you know.
Yeah.
I could out argue a lot of people. And so it was something that was deep and existential for me.
Who were maybe I'm getting ahead of myself maybe a little bit.
That's right.
Were there some thinkers, theologians that were influential for you particularly? Like for me, I'd say Marcus Borg was someone who I'd say like in many ways saved my faith.
Yeah. No, I can't like point to any one or two particular people. I was very widely read. And I wanted to take the intellectual questions very seriously. And even to this day, you know, leaps of faith or claims for blind faith do not appeal to me at all. So I would say it was a variety of people and a variety of experiences that kind of brought me down a journey away from my more fundamentalist initial background.
What is being a Christian now like? What does that look like to you as opposed to, you know, your early years?
Well, my primary goal in life, what I care most about, is living a life of love. That's what I think about, write about. That's the orienting concern of my life. And in some ways, that's not that much different than when I was a teenager and I was trying to be, you know, follow Jesus.
Yeah.
It's just that over time, what it means to live a life of love has changed as I have changed, as my own perspectives have, I think, developed in a positive way.
Can you elaborate on that? I'm curious to hear more on that.
In terms of what it means to live a life of love?
Yeah, then versus now.
Well, I think then living a life of love meant primarily, I love you, so I want you to go to heaven. So let me get you to say this prayer to accept Jesus into your heart.
Yeah.
That was kind of how I understood love. Then it was maybe a little bit bigger. It would be, look, I want to love you by helping you, giving you some food, giving you some money so that you will see that I'm a good Christian and that Jesus is really the right way to find salvation. So it was kind of like a bait and switch, maybe in some ways. So that was what love was at that time. Then, I mean, today, I think of love as much deeper. I happen to believe in an afterlife, but I don't think that's the primary purpose for living like Jesus lives. I care about not only people's souls, but their bodies. I care about the environment and animals. I try to integrate all dimensions of not only my life, but society and civilization in the lens of love, we might say. So I have a much broader perspective of what love entails than I did when I was an 18-year-old.
That's interesting. You say you love people's bodies, not just their souls. Such a, I think, a distinct way of saying so much of what the theology of, at least as I would say it, conservative Christianity is about. It's like We love your soul, but we're just, your body, whatever.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so. There's a lot of Gnosticism, implicit Gnosticism.
Yeah. Yeah.
They wouldn't say it quite like that,
Right.
but it amounts to that.
Yeah. Talk about a spiritual practice you've developed or found meaningful.
Well, maybe two come
Yeah.
most quick to mind. I'm a hiker and photographer.
Oh,
I
okay.
spend a lot of time on the trails in the backcountry, talking with animals, spending time in nature. That's become a really important part of my life, and not just the time in nature, but the artistic element as well as a photographer. So that's one important practice. On a daily basis, I have a practice of breathing prayer in which I breathe in symbolically God and breathe out symbolically love. And so I'll just think about God and then think about love. And after I do that for a little bit, then I'll sort of set my intentions for the day, what I'm planning to do, maybe some struggles or arguments I've had with family members or Facebook or something. And I'll just try to set my intentions and say, okay, I want to do this different. I want to help this person. I want to write this book or whatever. That's a big part of my daily practice.
Awesome. Awesome. I was going to ask you, what part of the country do you live in then where you hike so much?
I live in southern Idaho.
Okay.
Which is one of the best places to live if you like to hike. 2/3 of the state is publicly owned, and so there's lots of places to go, and you're not on private property.
That's good. Well, great. Let's talk about your role as the kind of one of your things, I suppose what you're known for, one of the things you're known for is Open Relational Theology, and you're the director, is that correct, of the Center for Open and Relational Theology?
That's right. Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah. So, let's talk a little bit about, give me a broad definition, I guess, for myself and for our listeners.
Yeah. Let me start with relational.
Yeah.
Open and relational theology not only believes that we are relational beings who live in a relational world, but also that God is relational. And if you're like me and you come from a fairly pietistic background where, you talk about loving Jesus and having a personal relationship with God, the idea that God is relational fits really nicely because a relational God is interacting with you. This God is happy when you do well and disappointed when you do poorly. And it's the God described by most of the Bible who's interacting with society. It surprises lots of people to discover that most of the major Christian theologians in Christian history have not believed that God is relational. They believe that God is, to use the classic language, impassible. God is unaffected by anything that happens in the world. And so that's the relational element of open and relational. The open part is a word that emerged in the mid-90s to talk about the future being open. You can probably relate given that we have similar backgrounds. When I was a kid, the theological fights were between the Arminians and the Calvinists.
Yeah.
And the Calvinists believed that God had predestined and foreknown everything from the foundation of the world. And I was on the Wesleyan Arminian side. We believed in free will, and I still believe in free will. But we thought that God did not predestine everything, but in some strange way, God could foreknow everything that was going to happen. So what we thought was indeterminate, we thought that was up in the air, contingent, somehow God already knew exactly what was going to happen. Well, open theology says that no, that's not the case. God can't know with absolute certainty everything that's going to happen in the future. And the reason that God can't know that is that God also experiences time with us moment by moment. So that's what the open part of open relational is about.
The words of like God is immanent and also transcendent, I feel like relates here because I think the classic kind of view of God would say that God is transcendent. God is both immanent and transcendent. God transcends time and space and all that, but also is in some way immanent here with us now. That's interesting. I didn't. So one thing I was going to ask you about is kind of how this. And I don't know if you remember, but I've actually asked you this on Twitter like a year ago or two.
Oh, my memory's not that good, so you probably have to refresh it.
So, because I remember I listened to another podcast you did talking about this, and I asked you, like, what's the similarity between open relational theology to some other similar type theologies, process theology, and then open theism?
Yeah. So the phrase open and relational is a way to kind of have an umbrella under which there are a variety of options. So open and relational is this big umbrella, and then underneath that is process theology, openness theology, relational theology, some feminist theology, some Wesleyan theology, some et cetera, et cetera. So that's kind of just the big umbrella. Process and openness folks have a lot in common. They're both open and relational, for instance. But most process theologians want to think about God's power in such a way that God can't do some things that some of the openness folks think that God can do. So probably the biggest difference between what I'll call classical open theology and classical process theology is the difference in how they think about God's power.
Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The process tradition has been shaped by a variety of issues, one of them being the problem of evil. If God is so loving and if God's so powerful, then why doesn't God prevent the unnecessary suffering, the pointless pain, the genuine evils of life? And process folks, through a variety of different ways, have come to believe that God simply can't prevent evil. Now, the openness folks, they tend to hear that and they want to say, hold on a second, I don't want to give up all the kind of divine sovereignty sort of issues that process people seem to give up. And so they typically will say things like God made a choice when creating the world not to intervene very often, or God has voluntarily decided to withdraw controlling power so that we have free will. So it's I tend to think of it as a difference between God choosing to give freedom and allowing what happens versus God necessarily giving freedom and can't stop, what things are evil. I think that's kind of the biggest difference.
Now, if I understand your work correctly, I mean, you have a book titled this,
Yes.
and reading some of the stuff you sent me prior to this,
Yeah.
you would say that God can't, right?
Yeah, so my view is kind of a strange in between those two positions I just mentioned. I'd characterize it like this. Some people believe that God voluntarily gives freedom and agency to creation and chooses to allow things to happen that God could stop if God wanted to. And so that's I call it a voluntary self-limitation view. On the other side of me, and this pertains to some process people, but not all, some process people talk as if God is constrained or limited by external powers like the God-world relationship or metaphysical laws, or to use the language of many Christians, the principalities and powers.
Yeah.
My view is kind of in between there. It says this: God really can't control anyone or anything, not because some external thing is constraining God, but also not because God voluntarily chooses not to. I say God can't because God's nature is self-giving, others empowering love. And therefore, since that's God's very nature, God can't control others. So it's a kind of an argument about God's nature that, quote, constrains God's power rather than external constraints or divine choice.
Yeah, so it really comes down to the character, or if that's the right word, of who God is. Like,
yes.
Yeah, like that's not God's purpose to control or not control then.
Right. if I got really technical, it would be something like this. In God's nature, love comes logically before power. And since love comes first, God can't choose not to be loving. So love, we might say, limits God's power or constrains God's power. And that makes it the case that God can't single-handedly prevent evil.
I was thinking about, are you familiar with Harold Kushner?
Sure.
His book, what is
When
it?
bad things
Yeah,
happen to good people.
because
Yeah.
he has this chapter where he talks about Job and the end of the book of Job, and I feel like that's his premise that God can't. So I'm curious, like, I'm asking you to read into Kushner's work, I suppose, a bit, but what's the similarity there?
I think there's lots of similarities. The biggest difference is that I come out very clearly about God's inability to single-handedly stop evil, and that inability being linked to God's loving nature. Kushner's book is not quite so clear. You can read it and you're not quite sure why God can't stop this.
Yeah.
So I think that's the biggest difference.
Yeah, well, this is good. So you mentioned, or at least some of the things I was reading about you, you try to make clear that you feel like this fits with Scripture, this kind of view, and also with science. Let's take the science first.
Great.
And I'll say, as someone who, like, one of the things I struggle with about modern Christianity is that I feel like it's cosmologically, like, just incongruent with modern cosmology.
Yeah.
Like, I think about even some of, like, the modern worship songs we sing, and it's like God sitting on a throne, and we sing that, and I wonder, like, I feel like that's, but maybe I'll jump ahead here. Well, maybe I'll ask this, and you can come back to this if you want to ask but I'm curious, like, what does worship look like in a open and relational God? But if you want to answer the first part of the question, because I'm giving you a really loaded question here.
Yeah. Well, I think too much of Christian theology either ignores contemporary science or cherry picks the few things that sort of fit what they've already believed. And I'm a great believer that Christian theology ought to be integrated with science.
Mm-hmm.
And that means that some of the cherished views of Christian theology in the past should be jettisoned, should be put aside. But it also means that when we think about science, we have to be open to things that are metaphysical, theological. And so it's not just that theology's given up everything in the age of science. There's a lot of, we'll call it mechanistic or materialistic philosophical assumptions in contemporary science that I think also should be jettisoned. So in this ongoing dialogue between science and theology, there's give and take on both sides if we're going to have what I think is a plausible conception or explanation of what goes on in reality.
So yeah, let me ask then that second part of the question then. Like, what does worship look like? I think I'll speak as like a pastor. That's my biggest struggle is like, what does worship look like? What does the worship setting look like when we're thinking about an open and relational God?
Well, there's so many things I could say here, so I'm going to try to constrain myself to a few. One is that, I think a pastor ought to regularly remind people that when we read the scriptures, we can listen to what's being said and think of it in metaphorical rather than literal kind of way. So take the example you just gave, God on a throne.
Right.
I mean, I think God's omnipresent, so God's on every throne, if we were to talk about it literally.
Sure.
But I think that's a metaphor, a symbol to talk about God somehow being effective or active or powerful or influential. I mean, it can go a lot of different ways. So that would be one thing I would say. Another thing, I think an open and relational worship leader ought to bring in the majestic aspects of contemporary science, because I think there's some incredibly beautiful and marvelous and motivating elements to it. An obvious one is the immensity of the universe.
Sure. Yeah.
That just is mind blowing. But even if we don't go sort of big, you can go micro, and the amazing things that happen at the micro level of reality. These are awe-inspiring things.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're like me and you think God is present both in the micro and the macro, then your praise becomes informed by scientific advancements that help, I think, both worship and science. And since I'm rattling things off, let me give a third one, okay?
Yeah, go.
This third one is very personal for me.
Mm-hmm.
So I believe in a relational God. I think God is actually affected by what happens in our lives.
Mm-hmm.
I used to go to worship service, and I'm from a low church tradition, so we rock and roll. We get after it. But I used to go and think to myself, we're singing all these praise songs. We're talking about how God is holy and mighty and creator. And I used to think to myself, well, God already knows all those things.
Mm-hmm.
Like, are we just reminding ourselves of these divine attributes? I mean, there's a place for that, but, is that just what worship is just sort of rehearsing our theology in song? That's what... But then I started thinking to myself, hold on a second. If I really think God is affected by what goes on, that means God's own well-being could be enhanced by my praise and worship. So if I'm very discerning when I worship. Like if there's lyrics up there I don't believe, I don't sing them.
Yeah.
But if there are lyrics up there that I'm totally on board with, I go for it. I'm worshiping with gusto. And if God is truly affected by what I do, that means God is getting, jacked up by my getting jacked up in worship. And that means what I do really has an influence on the God of the universe. And that motivates me to worship.
So I have to ask then, thinking about this from like a conservative or traditional theological context, like worship, like, I don't know if you've heard this, like I've heard it said, like, God doesn't need our worship, but I don't know, this may be unfair, but to me, it almost came across as like narcissistic, like God needs our worship, like in a narcissistic way.
Yes.
Right? Hopefully I don't get struck by lightning right now.
Well, there was two fundamental beliefs that were at odds with one another.
Mm-hmm.
You look at the Westminster Confession, for instance, and it says God created as a display of God's glory because God wanted to be glorified. And it sounds very narcissistic, like God saying, tell me how great I am.
Yeah.
But that, of course, doesn't fit with the idea that God doesn't need us. So, there was tension in theology there.
Mm-hmm.
And so what it oftentimes felt like to me in settings in which God was thought to be unaffected, it was more like God wanted us to worship because we needed to be obedient, almost slaves.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
We're cowering under this amazing and awesome God who could smite us at any moment if God wanted to. Whereas I think of God first and foremost as love. I think of God as a friend. I think of God as someone with whom I can cooperate and partner. And in that way of thinking of God, then all of a sudden this worship, as I mentioned earlier, starts to make a lot more sense because it's not that God is like saying, oh man, I just got to be praised. Tell me how great I am.
Yeah.
It's we're working together and God is pleased by our worship. But also we ourselves, our own well-being can be enhanced by the worship experience.
Interesting. I want to touch on something you said earlier too about worship affecting God. Certainly classical theology is that God is this unmoved mover type thing.
Right.
The same yesterday, today, and forever. Or that's Jesus Christ, but we've used those same words to talk about God. What is someone who most resonates with process theology? I think process theology has room for this idea that God can change or is influenced, but I haven't really thought about the idea of so much of like humanity's actions affecting God. So I'm curious if you can elaborate more on what that looks like.
Yeah. So the idea here, and this would be true of both process and openness, folks, the idea is that God is an experiential being, just like you and I are experiential beings.
Mm-hmm.
And as experiential beings, our experiences are affected by others. And so just like the conversation we're having right now, I'm affecting you and you're
Yeah.
affecting me. An omnipresent being who is experiential is going to be affected by everything. That's the changing part of God, or the passible part of God. But process and openness folks, open and relational people, they also like to talk about God having an unchanging nature.
Yeah. That's
So it's not
literally
like
the next question I was going to ask
yeah.
you.
So, it's not like God's just going to go this way and that and have mood swings and sometimes, get angry and do evil. No, God's nature has been eternally the same. It's loving,
Mhm.
it's, compassionate, etc. But God's experience changes in ongoing relationship.
And I think that's to me, I think it's pretty profound when we think about the idea that God suffers with us,
Mm-hmm.
feels pain with humanity. I think I've always found that profoundly unique, that way of thinking about God. Because, again, in my mind, so much of the kind of classic theology of God is just this, again, this kind of unmoved mover who is
Right.
kind of like, meh.
Yep, that's exactly what it is. I mean, I think if I'm given a charitable interpretation of classical theology, I would say they were worried about having a God who would be affected by the world and kind of go rogue. You
Yeah.
know, God would say, I'm loving, but if you really push me over the edge, I'm going to kick your butt.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas, and I can understand that worry, but if you have the view that I'm proposing, that God's nature or God's essence is unchanging, immutable, forever steadfast, but God's experience is changing, is affected, then you've got a relational God whose nature can't, he can't go rogue, you might say.
Yeah. I'm curious too, when I think about, I know a lot of times Christians don't want to acknowledge this, that our culture and our context affects the way we think and believe about God and Christianity. How much do you think, because like when I think of like modernism, like I can't help but see all the way that modernism has shaped, Christianity, 150 years ago. How much do you think like this, whether we call it postmodernism, whatever this how do I say it, milieu
Milieu, yeah.
we're living in is shaping our theology today? And then what are your thoughts on kind of that
Yeah,
trend, I guess?
I think it's not only inevitable that contemporary philosophy, culture, contemporary ways of living, it's not only inevitable that it's going to affect theology, but it's also in some ways positive.
Hmm.
However, I'm also a Bible guy.
Yeah.
And the vision of God that I'm presenting, I think fits very well with the broad themes of Scripture. So in some ways, I'm like more traditional than John
Interesting.
Calvin and
Yeah.
Augustine and Aquinas. I'm
Yeah.
more biblical in terms of my view of God. And so I don't want to put all the emphasis upon how theology must change to the times. There's also some really profound truths in Scripture that the classic Christian tradition has ignored.
I mean, I think the other way we could say this, and I'm curious if this would resonate with you, is like this: if you're saying that God it is experiential and changes maybe I put it in this words, like how God relates to us. Is it possible that God has related to humanity at different points in time?
Sure, in the specifics, but not in the general. So,
Sure. Yeah.
to put it like this, God
Yeah.
has always loved everyone at all times.
Mm-hmm.
However, the specific ways in which God loves are going to be different depending on the person.
Mm-hmm.
Let me and the age. Let me illustrate this by talking about my three daughters. All three of them played soccer when they were younger.
Mm-hmm.
And let's just, for the sake of this particular example, say that my nature of love was fixed. I'm going to love them every single moment of their life because that's who I am.
Yeah.
But when I'm out in my backyard playing soccer with them, when they're younger, I'm going to love them in specific ways that are different than when they're older. Like I'm going to kick the ball gently to them. I'm going to do certain things. But when they get in high school and they're stronger, I'm using my old man tricks. I'm giving them hips, and kicking the ball hard.
Yeah.
Not because I don't love them. It's because I do love them. And I know that kind of soccer is going to help them improve. So the fact that I love my daughters is unchanging, but how I express that love changes depending on who they are and how I can help them.
Good. Yeah, that's helpful. Good. Let's talk about how God relates to the future. This is one I'm curious about.
Yeah.
You use word, God doesn't. What'd you say? God doesn't know the future? How'd you say that?
God doesn't know the future with certainty. Yeah.
Future with certainty. One thing I've heard when talking about process theology, for instance, is this idea that there's like these multitude of possibilities, and God's omniscience is that God doesn't know what's going to happen, but God's aware of all the possibilities. Would you describe open and relational theology in a similar way, or how would it differ then?
Yeah. I mean, there's open and relational thinkers have varying different ways of talking about this, but the one you expressed is probably the most dominant. It says that God knows absolutely everything that's knowable. God is omniscient. Omniscience for God means knowing everything that happened in the past, everything that's happening in the present, and all the possibilities for the future. But because the future is a realm of possibilities and they haven't actually yet become actual, God can't know them as actual because God knows them as possible. So sometimes people will criticize open and relational people and they'll say, well, your God doesn't know everything. And we respond with, yes, God knows everything that is possible to know. It's just that the future isn't possible for anyone to know until it becomes the present, till it becomes actual.
Yeah, and that aspect really, I think, resonates a lot in my mind with, much of the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible, depending on what words we want to use. When we think about like God having dreams for the people of Israel, like, God having plans for them, wanting the best for them, and then that doesn't happen, and then God being grieved because that didn't what God wanted or hoped best for them didn't come about.
Right. Yeah. Open theism ideas are all over in the Bible. A lot of people don't know that more than 40 times God is said to repent, which means to have a change of mind.
Yeah.
But also think about all the covenants. Like one of my favorite one is the Chronicles one, where God says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face, I will do, and he lays out certain things.
Yeah.
But if they don't, I will hand them over to this. Well, that sounds like the future hasn't yet been decided. God's not sure what God's going to do. It's going to be dependent on how the people respond. And that's open theology right there.
Well, the last thing I want to ask you about is, in my mind, the hardest. So it may be nothing for you, but prayer. And I'll just say this and this is not, I've said this before to folks in my church, like growing up very conservative, prayer meant one thing to me. And it was kind of like you make a petition to God and it's kind of like, yes, no, maybe, depending on how God feels depending on your faith, depending on whether it's part of God's plan or not to make this happen. And when I kind of left that traditional understanding of Christianity, like I seriously probably didn't pray for like 8 years.
Yeah.
So I want to hear more about prayer and what it looks like here.
Yeah, I've got a lot to say about that. Let me, before I give you my answer, do a shameless plug, okay?
Yes, do.
I wrote a book a few years ago called God Can't that's really sold well and helped a ton of people. But one of the questions people had when they read the book or heard me speak was the prayer question.
Yep.
So I wrote a follow-up book that came out the summer of 2020 called Questions and Answers for God Can't. And there's a whole chapter on prayer. And so what I'm about to say, you can get the developed version
Yeah.
that particular book. So,
And for anybody listening who's a denominational hierarchy on me, I do pray in some capacity now. Thank you.
well, I've had several letters from pastors who read my book and said, now I can start praying again. So
Whoa.
there's
Yeah.
lots of people who are in that boat.
Yeah.
So let me set it up for the listener by looking at 3 models of prayer and then giving you my view. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So model number 1, we'll call this the Calvinist God predestines everything model.
Mm-hmm.
I tell you, I can't get motivated to pray if God has already decided everything in advance. Like, and even my lack of motivation, God must have decided. So it makes no sense to me to petition prayer if that's true. Most people don't believe in that God, but there are some.
It's kind of like goes back to what you said about worship, like the narcissistic God, like God just needs us to pray because God wants us to pray.
And God determines that we will. We have no free will but to. Anyway, most people don't have that view. Most people have more of the second view. And it's the view that says God can single-handedly fix things, and maybe sometimes does, whether we pray or not.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the problem with this view is it kind of gives the impression that God is on the sidelines, arms folded, saying, Lauren, I'm not going to jump in and fix this unless you ask me.
Yep.
And then you pray, and then God says, well, you're going to have to ask me 37 times.
Do a little better.
Yeah. And that just doesn't paint a picture of a loving God.
No.
And it also doesn't motivate me to pray, because if God can single-handedly fix it without my prayers, and if God is perfectly loving and a whole lot smarter than me, then why the heck should I pray?
Yeah.
So most people, when they think about those 2 options, they kind of drift toward the third possibility. And this is kind of like a God who's not really interacting, who's maybe watching us from a distance, like Bette Midler's God.
Yeah, yeah.
And really what prayer is for these people is not petitioning God in any way. It's just kind of working on your own self-help kind of thing. Like prayer, they'll say things, and I get this in mainline churches when I
I was just about to say that. Like, this is a mainline view of prayer right here, the third option.
Yep. So prayer is basically, just figuring your own ideas out, helping yourself. So 4th model, this is the one that I advocate. It presupposes 2 ideas. One of them I've already mentioned, that God is actually affected by what we do. And since prayer is an action, prayer is going to have some effect on God. Second idea is that we live in an interrelated universe, and my actions affect other things and other people in the universe.
Mm-hmm.
So a relational God in a relational universe. The third idea is that God is relating to us and all creation moment by moment by moment. That's the time part, the openness part. So that means that when Lauren prays in this particular moment, his prayer is having an effect upon God, effect on himself, on his environment, other people perhaps, etc. And when that happens, in the next moment, God has new resources, new material, new information, new possibilities. There are new avenues for God to act in the next moment because of what happened in the previous moment, which included Lauren's prayers. It doesn't going to guarantee the kind of outcomes that, Lauren might want, because the other people in the world have free will, and I think there's indeterminacy at the quantum level, et cetera. But it does mean that what we do really has an effect upon the future that's developing, and God is a part of that. And so I think then petitionary prayer can actually make sense. Again, it doesn't guarantee outcomes, but it provides new avenues, new possibilities, new opportunities for God in God's ongoing relationship with the world.
I'm wondering, would you say it? I've sometimes used this language, and I wonder if it makes sense in how you're framing it. Like, almost as if you're putting energy out there into the universe. Is that fair?
That's fair. Energy, I don't usually use that word. I like possibilities better. But the thing I like about energy is that it suggests that there's real activity that's happening. Sometimes the word possibilities doesn't connote that as
Yeah.
well. So
Yeah.
Energies has that positive dimension to it.
Well, I really think that's such a more helpful version or understanding, because like you said, it's either those first two understandings, which kind of like, my prayer really doesn't make a difference. It's just about keeping God happy, I guess. Or, do I did enough of it? And then that third version you said, this common in mainline or liberal traditions, is like, I guess I got to do this for my own self-development, but it doesn't really make a difference.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Good. I'm glad you found that helpful. And actually, oh, hey, this is really going to sound like shameless promotion.
Go for it.
Well, do you have like notes that you put with your podcast?
Unfortunately, only that I'm writing down myself right now. But...
Okay. Well, I was just going to say, I recently made that chapter on prayer available free to people if they sign up for my newsletter. So why don't I'll send you that little link, and you can make it available however you want. And people
I have to figure out how to do that in my show notes. But yeah, I can work on that.
Cool.
Yeah. Well, this is great because I think, like I said, I'm a pastor, so trying to figure out how to make theology relatable to people, something I'm passionate about. And I think, like, from my perspective, at least, that seems to be one of the biggest disconnects between church and the world, is like, we have a theology in so many places of Christianity that just doesn't make sense for our context. And that's why I've come to appreciate, I think, this broad nature of theology, as we're talking about, this umbrella of open and relational theology. So let's take a break real quick, and we'll come back with some closing questions.
It's not like we haven't all said it enough lately. These are unprecedented times. COVID-19 has upended the way we do life, community, and church. As church leaders, we find ourselves disoriented. Outreach, connection, cultivating a sense of team among church staff and creatives, nothing works like it did before. Torn Curtain Arts gets it, and we're here to help. We strengthen the creative soul of churches. It's why we exist. And in these times, we have dedicated ourselves to helping churches set up live streaming solutions and assisting with live events. We also provide coaching for worship leaders, as well as substitute worship leading for both in-person and online events. Contact us at torncurtainarts.org and let's chat about how we can keep you connected to your creativity in this season and grow your community.
All right, we're back with Dr. Thomas Jay Oord. And Tom, you can take these closing questions as seriously or not as you'd like to, but if you were Pope for a day, what is that? What's the day look like? Anything you want to do?
Oh, well, I would change the Catholic Church's view on women, LGBTQ. I would endorse Pope Francis's vision for ecology. But those three things come to mind.
That's a full day right there. That's a full day. A historical figure or theologian you'd want to meet or bring back to life?
I've been really influenced by the theologian John Wesley, so I'd like to hang out with him a little bit.
Cool. I'll help our Methodist friends here. They might appreciate that. What do you think history will remember from this current time and place?
I think historians will look back on the U.S. culture and shake their heads and wonder what happened with the Trump presidency.
Yeah. And we're recording this, a little bit over a week after the election. And some sense it's still a bit TBD, to be honest. Last question. What do you hope for the future of Christianity?
I hope that we will, I say we because I'm a Christian, we will be not only captured more deeply by a vision of divine love, but also work that out intellectually in ways that not only make sense in our everyday life, but also help us make sense of the biggest scientific, philosophical, and cultural issues of our time. That we would understand love to be not just personal, although that's important, but also social and even cosmic.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Well, now's your big chance, Tom. Plug away. Where can people find out more about you?
All righty. I have a personal website, which is my full name, thomasjayoord.com. Some of the ideas we've been talking about today is in this book, God Can't, that I really wrote for a wide audience. So it's not like an academic book. And it's been helpful to a lot of people. So of my books, I think I would recommend that one as a good one to start with.
Yeah, I have a copy of his book. Unfortunately, it's been on my shelf for about 6 months. Every time I get close to it, there's a bunch of other books I want to buy and get.
I understand that.
So hopefully we'll get to it here eventually. But thank you so much for your time. Really enjoyed this conversation, and appreciate you taking the time out of your schedule.
Hey, I've enjoyed it too, Lauren. Thanks for the opportunity.
All right. Well, peace be with you.
And with you.
Thanks for joining us on the Future Christian Podcast. To learn more about Lauren or the podcast, visit future-christian.com. But hey, before you go, do us a favor, subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. It really helps us get the word out to more people. Thanks, and go in peace.